Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for November 18th, 2022. It's Friday, I got a lot of questions from you, so I'm going to go right into the questions because that's the best way to get at the developments of this last week, which was an extraordinary week in many ways. So the first question, and again, some of these are multiple questions that I'm compiling as one just for the sake of an executive summary. Do you think the Ukrainian missile which hit Poland was done deliberately to force NATO directly into war with Russia? Now, instead of speculating on this, let's look at the facts, and I'll start with several comments. One was from Helga Zepp-LaRouche in the interview I did with her yesterday, which is posted on our website, and which I'll give you a link in the description section below. But what she said is, quote, "I think we should really all study this incident because it shows how rapidly, because of stupidity, provocations, overreactions, a combination of all of these, we can go into a situation where we have a full-fledged NATO-Russia confrontation, because that's what was on the verge of happening," unquote. She's referring to the fact that immediately after this happened, there were calls flying around from the tabloid press, from officials of NATO, from Eastern European countries, for immediately invoking Article 4 of NATO for consultation, or even Article 5, which would require action under the line that a threat against one nation is a threat against all, which could have put NATO into an immediate direct confrontation with Russia, even though, as it presently stands, NATO is in many cases involved in a war against Russia. Now, going further on this, we have a comment from Scott Ritter on the game played by NATO, and this is from an article that appeared in RT titled "NATO's Hair Trigger: The Polish Missile Incident Was a Close Brush with Nuclear Annihilation." And he wrote, "Let there be no doubt, NATO was aware that the missile was a Ukrainian surface-to-air missile the moment it was launched. The airspace over Ukraine is one of the most highly monitored locations in the world." So he said the question, therefore, is, given this, what kind of game was being played at NATO headquarters with the moves to escalate against Russia? And he said that this episode, quote, "exposed an ugly reality about the eastern reaches of NATO today. The new upstarts in Eastern Europe seem hell-bent on finding a mechanism that will justify a NATO intervention in Ukraine." He continues, "The Russophobic officials that dominate the governments of Poland and the three Baltic republics act like lemmings running toward the Ukrainian cliff, oblivious to their fate as they chase the fantasy of NATO defeating Russia on a European battlefield," unquote. So I think that's fairly straightforward. Now let's just add a couple of points here. The discussion of invoking Article 4 and Article 5 was not only premature but reckless. You have the Zelensky provocation, the president of Ukraine denying that it was a Ukrainian missile, insisting that it was not a Ukrainian missile, and then you have his foreign minister, Kuleba, who said any assertion that it was a Ukrainian missile is a, quote, "conspiracy theory." Now, minimally, while we ducked the possibility of a broader war, the calls immediately came out saying that it was still Russia's fault and that there must be more weapons, more arms, more commitment to Ukraine in this fight, including air defense. The Germans rejected this. So far, Biden has continued to stand against this. But you can see the explosive potential for war by miscalculation or by accident. Now, this brings us to the second question, which I had about 4 or 5 people asking this. What is the actual status of the war in Ukraine? According to media and Western officials, it's big success for Ukraine, big defeat for Russia. And one person wrote, well, Scott Ritter Colonel Douglas MacGregor and others disagree. What is your assessment? Now, you can start with the Russian Ministry of Defense statements, where they put out a statement daily about the status of the war, which are at wide variance from what we're getting in the Western press. But here's one that I think is an interesting one to note. The comments by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, General Milley. Now, Milley's a mixed character. I wouldn't take what he says as the gospel truth. But what he said is there's a stalemate in the war, similar to World War I, and that this is the ideal time to move to negotiations, meaning that while Ukraine has recaptured some of its territory, it can negotiate from a position of strength. The Russians would probably be interested in negotiating, and now's the time to do it. And of course, there are some indications there may be some channels of communication that have opened up between Russia and the United States, including the meeting by CIA Director William Burns with his counterpart Sergei Narishkin of Russia, which took place in Istanbul, and the reports of discussion by NSC Director Sullivan with his Russian counterpart. But we don't know how serious those are, but we can see the reaction to this. Even the hint of negotiation, the word in the background is appeasement. We should not appease Putin, as though this is the same as Chamberlain and Hitler in Munich in 1938. And in particular, from the British. The Economist, the magazine of the Rothschilds of the City of London, had an article basically saying that the Milley's statements show, quote, some American officials are showing signs of nerves. And the Economist says this cannot be allowed to happen. They say Milley's diagnosis and prescription are both flawed. Russia's army is in dire shape and on the retreat. Russia needs a pause. It should not be given one, say the great military experts of the London Economist. For Ukraine to press its advantage, it requires a steady supply of Western arms, ammunition, and equipment, the Economist writes. And they say that bold steps are demanded. Air defense systems, German Leopard tanks, Sweden's Gripen fighter jets. And of course, at the same time, Joe Biden has requested an additional $37 billion in aid for Ukraine. And the Economist ends by saying, it's time that Europe steps up too. So this is the line of the war hawks. And where's it coming from? Not necessarily the military, although the British military is totally in line with the Economist. But this is the policy of the corporate conglomerates that make up the broader entity known as the military-industrial complex, which is not just military and defense contractors, but includes corporate cartels, especially financial institutions. And there are some who say that the push for extending the war is the real economic policy of the Western countries trying to escape the death grips of a collapse. So that's, I think that's the answer to the second set of questions. Then there were those of you who wrote about the no red wave. What's the implication of this? And more importantly, do you think that opposition to Biden's funding and the Western funding of the war will grow? Well, there are a couple of people speaking out. One of the most prominent is Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona, who yesterday said that he will not support Biden's request, quote, to continue the needless death and destruction on both sides of this war, unquote. He points out the U.S. has a record $31 trillion national debt, record high inflation, disaster at the southern border, and he said it would be a huge error for Congress to use this lame duck session to fast-track Biden's shameful request for taxpayers' dollars to perpetuate a needless war. Now, he then raised some interesting questions. The Ukrainian regime's notorious corruption, that there's no accounting of where the U.S. money has gone. And this has also been raised by other Republican congressmen, including Thomas Massey from Kentucky. Then he said there are real concerns about possible corruption between the Biden regime, including Biden's son Hunter, and the government of Ukraine. And this, of course, is hanging over the question of the House of Representatives now that it's a small margin of a Republican majority. And he said that the sleazy dealings of Hunter Biden with Ukraine, quote, reek of corruption, unquote. Then he raises an interesting question, which gets into the fourth question I received from some of you, the case of the FTX crypto operation, which spectacularly collapsed right at the time of the election. Billions of dollars of people's savings wiped out. He points out that FTX was, quote, the second largest donor to the Democratic Party, and that this may have included millions from Ukraine. Taxpayer money sent to Ukraine may have been laundered and sent as an investment in FTX, which then donated the money to the Democrats. So this is I'll get to this in just a moment, but then Gosar finished his statement by saying, what we need is peace. And I continue to invite President Putin and President Zelensky to Arizona to engage in peace negotiations. So hopefully there will be some of this discussion that will be included in the new Congress. Now, the next question is, what do you make of the FTX scandal? And obviously it must be investigated, including the question of money laundering with Ukraine, funds for the Democrats. But the bigger question here is the role of Bitcoin and digital currencies. The Bitcoin operations typified by the FTX operation is for speculation. It's part of the exotic move into financialization, which is basically get-rich-quick schemes that are sometimes presented as a modern version of skirting around the control of the Federal Reserve. But like most of these financialization schemes, I actually should say all of them, which were launched because of deregulation, because of privatization, and so on, they're monetary tricks. They detract from investment in the real physical economy with the lure of quick riches for people who have extra money to invest, but also for pension funds, hedge funds, and others to draw funds into a speculative bubble away from real physical investment. Now, this is occurring at a point in which we have high inflation as a result of quantitative easing. Now we have the effects of quantitative tightening, which will probably lead to a string of chain reaction debt defaults. But we're also seeing the effects of this on government policy. The best example is the pathetic situation of the current Tory government in the United Kingdom, where you have the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hunt, releasing his program, which essentially is cut spending and raise taxes. The Office of Budget Responsibility of the United Kingdom put out a report yesterday projecting that this policy will lead to a 7.1% drop in British living standards over the next 2 years, fueled by a drop of 4.3% in disposable income. Of course, that will affect some sectors of the population much more than others, especially those who are unemployed or those who are partially employed or those who are employed in low-wage jobs. The effect of inflation and, in reality, wage freezes will drive people into desperation. With the high price of fuel, even though it's mitigated somewhat, the price of food is not going to be protected. And families are going to be forced to make terrible choices, while the Tories talk about the great moves to the new version of Thatcherism. Well, the Wall Street Journal makes the point, subliminally, that what's happening in the United Kingdom will soon be coming to a nation near you. And we see it in terms of Germany, we see it in France, and we also see it in the United States. Austerity, while at the same time, liberal funding of weapons shipments to Ukraine. Now, finally, the question came in, what came out of the meetings in Asia, the APEC, the ASEAN, and the G20? Well, what I would say is most important in this is we should be looking to Asia as an alternative. You have the Asian nations investing in physical economy, typified by the expanded cooperation around the Belt and Road Initiative. But the projects as a whole, the optimism, the idea that it's through investment in physical economy that you build the future, as opposed to these get-rich-quick schemes, which are the play on both the fantasies but also the desperation of ordinary people. Credit for economic growth in the investment in the real economy, the physical economy. That's Lyndon LaRouche's advocacy. His going back to the 1970s with his International Development Bank proposal, his debt bomb proposal. The way you deal with debt is you don't pay it. This debt was imposed on nations, especially in the global south, by greedy, looting bankers. And the effect of it was to siphon real wealth from those countries in the form of cheap raw materials and cheap wages, while doing nothing to build up a real economy. LaRouche proposed the International Development Bank to reverse that, and the debt bomb to reverse that, and then later his proposal for a new Bretton Woods. This will be discussed at our November 22nd Schiller Institute conference. It was also discussed extensively by Helga Zepp LaRouche in my discussion with her yesterday, which, as I said, will be linked at the bottom of today's update. So thanks for joining me. This is a moment where we need deep thinking. We need dialogue. We need discussion. We don't have to agree on everything. But what's necessary is to move from the insistence that there's only one way of doing business, which is under the so-called rules-based order, which is demanded by the speculative banks of London and Wall Street and enforced by the military of the United States and NATO. That's being rejected. And instead we need real dialogue, real discussion, typified by what the Indonesian president did with the G20 conference to steer it away from the confrontation between two blocs to try to get a real discussion. And that's what's necessary now. So thanks for joining me. See you again next week.